What happens when two bass road warriors spend quality time talking music and life with one of their peers? Find out every Monday at 8 on Notes from an Artist. Bassist, educator, author David C. Gross and bassist and head honcho of KnowYourBassPlayer.com, Tom Semioli, trade dates with the legends of rock, jazz, funk, blues, folk, country, and more. Notes from an Artist. Revealing conversations with the legends who've created the soundtrack of our lives. Every Monday at 8 on CygnusRadio.com. And check out previous episodes on our podcast. Notesfromanartist.buzzsprout.com.
What a great interview.
Trey Gunn. This is a fascinating story, David. He was born the same year I was, 1960. And it's amazing when you look at his career trajectory. He was a student with Robert Fripp, and then he became a member of King Crimson. How about that for a journey? He has collaborated with David Sylvain and Robert Fripp on several projects. He is a maestro of the Champan Stick and the Warr guitar. He was in the amazing double trio version of King Crimson with Tony Levin. And for all you Crimsonites out there, you must check out Vroom and Thrack. I know those King Crimson albums don't get as much attention as maybe some of the earlier stuff in Red, but those are just essential records. And there's what Robert Fripp has done is released many archival live performances of that double trio. So that's real important. We talked to Trey about that. He's also collaborated with Toya, who is Mrs. Robert Fripp. He's done records with John Paul Jones of Led Zeppelin, especially Zuma. That is another essential recording. He's done 15 solo LPs. He is a YouTube host, and he does amazing tutorials and anecdotes. And, he talks about the horizontal position of playing his Warr guitar, because we all get old, David, and we have various elements, but it's actually more ergonomically correct to play your guitar on your lap.
Especially for somebody who started life as a keyboard player.
Right, he did. He's really embraced digital distribution. He has had a phenomenal career outside the mainstream through education and niche marketing. So he does podcasts. He did the King Crimson transcription book from their early 80s canon, which again, essential to any King Crimson or prog rock fan. So it's really fascinating how Trey exists outside the mainstream, yet has a thriving career.
What I find very unique is his take on, if I was a kid now, or if I had a kid who wanted to learn music, I would tell them, don't read a note.
Yeah, he does read notes. Probably easier for us to say, who read music, to say, oh, you don't need to read music, but you really do. I think I'm going to disagree with Trey, because if you're going to internalize information, you have to read. David, imagine taking a school course if you didn't have a textbook.
The interview works out really, really nicely. Well, basically, we did two parts. It's another one of those interviews where there was just too much information and too much music to stick in a 2-hour session. So this week, as you're listening now, there's part 1. And after the new year, we'll get into part 2, which is also very fascinating.
All right. Bring on Trey Gunn.
Hey, guys.
Hey,
Trey,
so what's it been? 30 years, Trey?
Probably.
So, Trey, what have you been up to now that we're crawling out of lockdown?
What have I been up to? Well, I run my record label, 7D Media, and I have a partner now on that, which is awesome because it's a serious do-it-yourself operation. We have a lot of releases, actually, for our little independent label. I'm coaching a lot, coaching musicians, which I love. And then I'm recording a little bit of session stuff, but I'm working on this kind of long-scale project that we can talk about in more detail or not. That's completely through composed bunch of pieces. No improvisation. I'm not allowing myself any improvisation, and it's all on the Warr guitar. So it's kind of I've been approaching it like a string quartet or a chamber ensemble of Warr guitars. I've written most all of the music, which took me for frickin' ever. It has a lot of different elements than I'm usually using. Now I have to play it all, and it's pretty fucking hard, I gotta say.
Why don't people write easy music for themselves?
Exactly.
Well, Trey, let's start off with 7D Media, because a question that David and I ask, especially musicians of our generation, and you and I were born in the same year, that is it the best of times or the worst of times, in the sense that the way we were raised, Trey and David, if you wanted to put music out, you had to get what was known as a record deal. The argument used to be record labels, only sign a certain type of person, or they tend to follow trends, and they tend to do a bunch of marketing research And if it wasn't for the fact that the record industry executives in the 60s didn't know what they were doing, a band like King Crimson could get signed.
Right.
But now you have, and we all have, the power to go direct to the marketplace. We don't have to kowtow in front of a record label and get a pretty picture taken of ourselves, et cetera, et cetera. Right. Is it the best of times or the worst of times? In that?
It's not too sucky. There's good and bad things, obviously. But the good thing is no one can stop you from putting out music. And the awesome thing about that is people can actually explore where their creative vision takes them, as opposed to within an industry. People say they want to hear something new, but they don't for the most part. So you're actually not really allowed, well, you're certainly not allowed full creative leaps, but your creative leaps have to be within parameters of the known world, which really isn't a creative leap. Not really. It's not a hard line. And then, of course, the downside of that is there's too much music. Maybe that's a judgment call, too much, but there's so much supply that it's kind of devalued, and also it's just overwhelming as a listener.
It's interesting you say that because, right, everybody with one of these now, an iPhone, is a recording studio, is a record label. Everyone's a record label now. Everyone's signed. But then again, it probably wasn't much different on February 10th, the day after the Beatles were on the Ed Sullivan Show in 1964, and everybody went out and bought guitars and drums.
Yeah.
So,
one of the other interesting things that I don't feel like it's really affected the projects I was in. It might have been like the previous generation, but I could see how things probably were loosened up a little bit, was that when you had, so I'm taking this a lot from the older guys who I've worked with, when you, and I saw it as a music lover, when you had a band that was signed, you really weren't allowed to put out that much music. And so if there was someone in the band who had kind of a musical vision that maybe didn't quite fit that band, there's all this internal fighting about whether that thing gets to go in the project or the drummer gets to write his poetry so that he gets part of the publishing and all this. And now there's none of that. Hey, you got something cool you want to do? Just go do it. Don't smear it all over King Crimson. Just go make a solo record.
That was our guest Trey Gunn from his solo album 1,000 Years, the title track 1,000 Years. This is Notes from an Artist, cygnusradio.com.
I think that's a great freedom, that there's room for any idea to be explored. And actually, I was with a coaching client this week, and he was running into a thing that we all kind of run into, is if you have a lot of various interests, if you put them all in the same pot, it kind of dilutes them and makes it seem like you don't quite know what you're doing. So you just make a frame for each one of them. You just have 3 band names and you make 3 Bandcamp accounts. And you just let them be what they want to be. And you don't try to say, oh, all of this is Trey. Good luck. Here's an abstract thing. Here's a reggae thing. Here's a synth pop thing. They don't belong together. And now you can kind of separate that out. And that probably gives a lot of bands freedom to really be what they are, so that not everybody in the band is trying to get their little thing squished in there.
Now, you as a label owner, I mean, we still have to tip our hat to people like, John Hammond, Lou Adler, Clive Davis, who could find talent
and nurture it, which I've barely been on a major label, just a couple of times with Crimson, just a little bit.
That was King Crimson doing Thrack, the title track from that album, with our guest Trey Gunn on Warr Guitar. This is Notes from an Artist on cygnusradio.com.
And then with the David Sylvian, but David had so much reign with Virgin Records until he wasn't with them anymore.
That was David Sylvian doing God's Monkey with Robert Fripp and Trey Gunn. This is Notes from an Artist, cygnusradio.com.
So I was never nurtured, but you hear about the old days where there was nurturing, and take some seed money and go off and write for a year and we'll work with you. And, they were working because they're making an investment, and it's an investment. So they want to make their money back. It's not a grant.
It's always been a business. Look at the great recording artists of the 20th century. It doesn't matter if it's Frank Sinatra, Tony Bennett, Miles Davis, Charlie Parker, the Beatles, Laura Nyro. Their first few records didn't sell. They were not successful out of the box. Yet these visionaries, like the ones I mentioned, and of course there are more, realized that they had to find an audience, number one. And we're talking about the days when people went out and played every night. Plus, the audiences had to catch up to them because in many ways they were ahead of their time.
And grow the voice with the audience.
Right, exactly.
I've never had that kind of interaction, and I feel a bit of a loss, a sadness about it, not having that kind of producer who could say, not push you around, but say, here's where you are connecting. Here's where it's working. Let's follow that up more. I've kind of been all on my own, for better or worse.
A George Martin or an Eddie Kramer who could push people in the right direction. Yeah. But it's interesting now, if you look at what's considered the mainstream and what's considered maybe the fringe or the outside the mainstream, there's more outside the mainstream now because everyone is their own record label and distribution company than there are a Beyonce or a Nicki Minaj or David's favorite Cardi B. So it's really like the underground is now surfacing. And
it is. And it's global. So you can see like this weird shit coming out of Norway or funny spots in Paraguay or whatever. And they kind of have their freedom to, for me, the saddest thing in the world is to go into, you guys ever use this Radio Garden app? Have you seen this thing where you can tune? It's actually a map of the globe, like the old Google Earth. And you can actually spin around. You can go into Afghanistan and pick radio stations.
Wow.
And it's really fantastic. And you can save them. So I've got all these stations in Pakistan and stuff, and then a bunch in South America. And to me,
you may have the FBI after you very soon.
I know. For me, it's the saddest thing in the world to zoom in Pakistan and hear the same shit that you hear in France. It's like, wow, come on, But there's a lot of other stuff, There's a cool electronic music scene almost everywhere on the planet.
With 7D Media, how do you choose the artists?
It's a very quirky particular thing, and it's a very unusual model that I've just kind of based off my need. Basically, I had the framework built for myself and a couple of records that I was involved with some Seattle musicians. And we have a hard copy distributor, believe it or not. People still buy CDs and records. So the thing just kind of grew out of that. And the way it grew was that I can't afford to invest my money into somebody else's project. It's kind of a managerial curation conduit that we manage the thing. It's kind of for particular kind of artists, kind of mid-career artists who understand how hard it is, don't want to do the work, and kind of join in. And then we also have a bit of I don't know what you call it, kind of an artistic vision of actual innovation. I don't look for people generally. They're usually people we already know, but sometimes people write us, and if it feels like it fits, then it fits.
That was the Swiss group Sonar doing a Bill Laswell remix of their tune Monolith. That's on the 7D Media label, which is Trey Gunn's label. This is Notes from an Artist on CygnusRadio.com.
You were talking about records, and they used to be these things, David. Do you remember these? This is a CD, David.
We still make CDs, and people still buy them, and they still go into stores and buy them. There aren't that many stores. They still do it. And we've done a little bit of vinyl. I kind of try to talk people out of it because to ship a record to Europe right now is like $52.
And it gets there too.
Yeah. We have a couple of people that do it, or like they want records for to sell at shows as shows are coming back up, and we make the records available. Vinyl's pretty cool, but man, it's so heavy. When the first order came, there's this band in Switzerland called Sonar. They did a record with David Torn, and then they got Bill Laswell to do some remixes. So we did a vinyl of this record that Bill Laswell remixed and played on with David Torn, and then this really cool instrumental band from Switzerland, Sonar. And I went up to my post office box and to see the vinyl arrived, and I was like, 500 records, no big deal. Holy shit. It was like 10 fucking heavy boxes.
Oh, yeah.
And I was like, what have I done? This is crazy. And I got to get them into my garage, and we're a little more limited on that.
You said earlier, that one part of you could do one project, one part of you could do another, and you have these, let's say, middle-aged musicians. You really think about it. When we all were growing up, there wasn't as much of an AOR market, a this market, a that market. There was just music.
Yeah.
And so you could have Pink Floyd, you could have The Who, you could have all of this at once.
In the top 40. The top 40 was...
Yeah. So if you think about it, and it was all music, sure, someone in the band is going to deviate this way. Someone in the band is going to deviate that way. It makes sense that there were all these tensions going on. So the question then becomes, do you notice with the younger musicians that they're equally as derivative in sense of, we want to do this kind of thing, that kind of, or are they a little bit more homogenized because their music is a little more homogenized? Do you know where I'm getting at?
A little bit, yeah. I mean, it's funny. I have one experience comes to mind when I went to South by Southwest with Pat and Chemo with K2, this project I have. We played in South by Southwest. It's been 10 years, so it's almost like 10 years ago isn't even relevant now. But I can remember going to South by Southwest and walking around and listening to the bands and hearing, holy shit, there's 1,800 bands here, and every single one of them is not just alternative rock. They're this particular slice of alternative rock. To me, I found that so sad. I don't think it's like that anymore. I think there's a lot more diversity and curiosity, but it feels like it's still only a portion of what's put out there. You know, like some people really have taken the horse and just run wild with it. And other people, you know, you still want to be, especially young musicians, you still want to be accepted. You still want to be liked. You still want to be successful. And it's hard not to think that, in a sense, even if you don't think it consciously, you're saying, oh, this is what people like. This is what gets response to, kind of as far as I can go. The only other time that I hear younger people listening to music is when I'm at my jiu-jitsu school and they put on music, and it's fascinating to hear what gets put on the stereo, and different people put different things, and some stuff is totally derivative and other stuff is like, wow, that's kind of a weird mashup. And you know, every once in a while, I mean, let's put it like this, players are fucking amazing now. What they do with it is a whole other story, but the level of players that I see, just even in the derivative music, and I'm not talking about like auto-tuned and edited stuff, just really great bass players are really great keyboard players that blow away certainly the chops, if you know, kind of stuff that I used to listen to.
That was Opticus by K2. This is Notes from an Artist on CygnusRadio.com.
They have the advantage of YouTube. We had the advantage of, what was it, David? Midnight Special and In Concert.
Well, but you couldn't even rewind that shit.
Right, you couldn't. Or Saturday Night Live or Circus Magazine and Rolling Stone and Trouser Press. So obviously, you know, David and I being bass players, I never knew where Jocko put his hands on Teen Town. I tried it a billion different ways, and Donna Lee and all that.
Yeah.
And so they do have the advantage of that their education, obviously we all learn from watching others. Well, you're an educator yourself. Is it necessary for a musician in the 21st century to get a music education, as David and I knew, formal music education? You started off on classical piano.
Yeah. In a way, for me, that is the question of the age. You don't even have to say music. You could say any discipline.
Oh, a four-year college degree, I think, is obsolete, but that's my...
Yeah. It's a great question. Should you just go for it, or should you prep? Is kind of how I look at it. Like, should you just start writing fiction, or should you learn what verbs are? What's the best method? To just look at videos and study how to water ski, or just get on the skis? And I don't know. I see both things working. You know, neither works on its own, in my opinion. I guess if I was going to paint the ideal scenario, I would say get in the water and start swimming. And then after a bit, get out and ask somebody who's done some swimming to watch you swim, and then get some tips. And then very carefully go back in the water again. I think about this a lot because I practice jiu-jitsu and with some really high level guys that are beyond where I'm at. And then I'm practicing music as well at the same time, and seeing you have to get the general shape of the thing you're working on out there. Otherwise, you know, like I practice this little Bach piece every day, this little violin sonata, and you can't get, this is a great example. I'll use this example. You can't get anywhere if you don't get some of the notes together and get like the shape going.
Right, sure.
And once you get the shape going, then you need to kind of make some decisions about for me, I have to make a lot of fingering decisions because I use so many fingers.
You do.
You know, and then you kind of get it, you repeat it enough, exactly the same with jiu-jitsu. You repeat it enough that it starts to get comfortable. You don't get lost. You don't get confused. You know, like you have to repeat it enough so that you can kind of tie the thing together. Mm-hmm. And then it starts to sound pretty good. If you stop there, it doesn't go very far. Now what you have to do is you have to go go back in and like be flexible, and all those decisions and all that repetition, all that work you've done, you kind of need to be prepared to undo it all at another level. Like I might find out that some of my fingerings are wrong, or I'm playing it on the wrong string, but I programmed it in so well on this one string. A lot of people might just say, and a lot of people do say, it's good enough.
Right.
And that's fine. You actually kind of put a ceiling there. But if you want to go through that ceiling, you have to be prepared to go back in and undo all the work that you've done with a new decision. Like maybe I was like holding tension in my shoulder the whole time. And if I really want to be able to play this, I have to change that. Or maybe my breath is screwing things up. So now I have to go back and undo all that work again. I'm not dancing around your question. That's kind of that's kind of the educated part, right?
Right.
Like you're stepping back and you're getting some advice.
That was the tune "No Part of Me" by Steven Wilson, who is the frontman for Porcupine Tree. That was Trey Gunn playing Warr guitar as well as bass on it. And this is Notes from an Artist on CygnusRadio.com.
More to your question, boy, the thing I wouldn't do, I wouldn't learn to sight read as a kid.
That's interesting you say that, because I think there are advantages, David and I have discussed this, of a general education. Like a lot of kids, I wanted to be a rock star, so I started taking guitar lessons. Just so happens that my teacher was a classical guitarist, and he taught me.
So you got a broad. Right,
so I learned how to read, and importantly, to become a bass player, which I was the worst guitar player on the block, so I became the bass player. The classical guitar form is the same as an electric bass, a Fender bass. And then when I went to study bass, I studied with Ron McClure, who was a jazz musician. But again, I'm still wanting to play rock, but I learned from the jazz language. When I went to school in Miami, and I minored in music, because as I say to David, I don't want to waste all my parents' money. I had to study classical form and analysis. Yeah. And it gave me a broader sense of when I picked up the bass. Now, I just think it's great to sight read because you can remember bass lines that
idea. Well, you wouldn't have been able to even get into that education. It sounds like we did almost the exact same thing. Okay. You wouldn't have even been allowed access to that without those reading skills.
Right, exactly. Yeah. And you think about, and just as a soloist guitar, every note plays a different role within a chord. And if you see it on the paper, it internalizes it. Imagine taking a history course and you didn't have a textbook or a notebook to take notes in. Well, how would
I can though, but I can.
Well, you have a photographic.
I don't have an issue with reading music, and I'm glad it's so easy for me. But I do feel like, my mother was an English teacher for years and years, and she thought that for some reason, particularly boys, I don't know why, boys and girls were different for her. She thought that they shouldn't learn to read until they were 10. If she could teach them when they were 10 and they had been listening and learning stories and learning things orally, that they could learn to read in about 6 months, that she could bring them up to speed. I don't know what that would be like, but I do know that my level of sight reading, because I'm so visually oriented, it stood in the way of learning to hear.
Yeah, I've heard a lot of people say that.
Got in the way of that. And I would have been better to kind of suffer harder early on, had to play by ear. I definitely would. I've definitely spent a couple of decades catching up because I could sight read so well, because my intellect was so adaptable and able to grok these theoretical things. It kind of stood in for just pure, how many notes are in that chord? Which ones? And I had even though I went to college, I had a really shitty, I can say now, most of the teachers are dead. I had they gave me a really crappy ear training, really crappy. It was just textbook crappy.
Well, Trey, one of the things that intrigued me, one of the reasons I wanted to get on this interview with you is about a week ago, we interviewed Carl Berger. Carl is a brilliant jazz pianist and violinist. He wrote a book called The Music Mind, which I suggest everyone gets. And his point is, before you play a piece of music, learn it by heart. Hear it and learn it. Yeah. And listen, deep listen. Mindfulness is a part of that. And where you were getting to with going to another level, unlearning to relearn to such, it's actually a very, very important point, because we all create our own limits, whether we know it or not. We do, no matter how free and easy we think. I think the key is where you say some people go, it's good enough. The reality is it's never good enough. It can't be. You can't grow if good enough is good enough. And so what Carl was doing in this book was the concept of listening to each note, the fact that you never play the same note twice because of the physical space you're in.
The context is different for every.
It's fascinating. And so when I started thinking about your original coach program, which we really do need to talk about, I want to promote that as well. We're not talking about an original voice and how to sing. We're talking about an original voice.
Yeah,
the ability to be completely your own. And in some regards, you are right. Everyone's trying to, I wouldn't use the word impress people, but that's the first one that comes. But we all want to be liked. But we're all different. And how to celebrate that difference in your music is a tough thing. It really can be.
One of the things I do with some of my coaching clients, I get folks who are our age-ish or 50-ish or even late 40s who now have space in their life. They've left music behind for many years or decades, and now they want to get back in and they want to get serious. And now it's time to learn how to read music. And I'm like, are you sure? Adrian Ballou can't read music. And he passed the Zappa audition by ear, the only guy who's ever done that. And I'm like, I'm not saying you shouldn't, but let's figure out what you want to do. And if you need to learn to read music, absolutely. But if you don't, time's running out on us.
Right.
You should get to what you want to do. I'm certainly not opposed to notation at all. Notation is awesome. And I don't even know how you really need it to compose. It's one of the things that you really, we have these stories about Mozart. We don't even know if they're really true that he would compose whole things in his head. But either way, we're not Mozart. We need help. And notation is great for that. It's a communication tool. It's this and that. It just, for me, it got in the way of learning to hear.
Now, Dave Swift, I don't know if you're familiar with him. He's the most recognized bass player in the UK by way of his tenure on the Later with Jules Holland show.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
All right. So you've probably seen, if you've watched Jules Holland, you've seen Dave. And Dave came up playing classical music, trombone. And he said that reading, like you say, almost kind of held him back because, when you're reading what's on the page, you're told what to do. There's really no improv there.
Right.
And of course, it's the whole textbook. Well, if it's a G chord, you play a G, a B, a D, and et cetera, et cetera.
Right.
Whereas now he's our age, born in 1962, I think. And now he's trying to develop his ears, which is kind of how young people are doing it now. They're playing along with YouTube and their ears are developing first. And then they can decide whether or not they want to do the formal training with theory, learning notation. Now, in our generation, the idea was you were going to go into a recording studio and they had what was known as tape. David, remember that? Analog tape?
That's right. That's right.
Tape wears out, unlike Pro Tool. You better Yes, David's real. Tape, you wanted to get your rhythm section down in 1 or 2 takes because the tape wears out. So you had to be a proficient musician. So
that's right. I forgot that.
Right. You have to read your parts. You have to know what notes to play. It wasn't a cut and paste world like we have now. So now maybe you don't have to read, but I know damn sure if I was a band leader on a session, and I want to get this session done in 3 hours, I'm going to write out my parts so I can get what I need.
Yeah. But Tom, another thing, I'm doing this book with Michael Mannering now on alternate tunings.
Good luck to you there, buddy.
Oh, it's so much fun. It really is. The thing is, we have to do 2 things with this book. The first one is we have to use tablature. It's a necessary evil because when you're tuning your E down to a low B and you're doing certain fingerings, it's necessary.
Yeah.
So,
but if you put tabs in, you're saying it's a much more diverse.
Exactly.
Project. Yeah.
Exactly. You still have to read because you have to know that 2 ledger lines down is a low B.
Right.
You have to, which also goes along with that's a wonderful book you've come out with. It's beautiful.
Oh, the Crimson. It's crazy.
Hard as shit.
Yeah.
But beautifully done.
No, with the Crimson books, we were able to do the tunings, whatever the guys were actually using. And we did tabs, when we did the Thrack book, of course, Adrian's in the standard tuning and Robert's in his 5th tuning. And then I'm in 1-stick tuning and Tony's in a different one. And then when you go back to the 80s, the Discipline, everybody's in standard tuning, except Tony does a little funny thing. playing with the stick on Elephant Talk. He tunes the top two notes into a tritone.
That was probably one of the most recognizable King Crimson tunes, Elephant Talk. This is Notes from an Artist on CygnusRadio.com.
I put out another book prior to that, or somewhere in there, of just a bunch of my stuff. And we were trying to figure out, what do we do? Because not too many people play my instrument.
Right.
And a lot of people who play my instrument don't use my tuning. They use the standard stick tuning, which is fifths and fourths. I'm all fifths. So we thought, crap, we better just make two versions. So I tabbed it out in fourths and I tabbed it out in fifths. And I'm not going to do that anymore. Man, that's a lot of work.
No.
And, I had to guess, too, because I don't play in the fourths. So some things really were idiomatic to how your hands fall in the fifths. And I had to come up with voicings that were pretty unpleasant. But hey, that's how it goes in your tuning.
That was The Glove by Trey Gunn from his solo album, The Joy of molybdenum. And molybdenum is a chemical element with the atomic number of 42. This is Notes from an Artist on CygnusRadio.com.
Well, it's interesting that you chose, those three records. What was it? Discipline, Beat, and Three of a Perfect Pair, because those records turned my generation on to King Crimson. Again, I was born in 60, so a little too young to appreciate Court of the Crimson King and Wake of Poseidon and Red and all that stuff.
Yeah.
And then when we heard those records, we went, wow, King Crimson's pretty interesting. Let's go back and hear some of the previous stuff. But that was a very, very potent version of King Crimson.
Oh, yeah. I think I had a friend whose brother played the opening track from the first Crimson record when I was like 13.
That was the title track from the very first King Crimson record, In the Court of the Crimson King. This is Notes from an Artist on CygnusRadio.com.
Yeah.
I didn't know it was happening to me, like he was playing Emerson, Lake and Palmer, and then we heard that, and then I didn't hear any Crimson again until the opening piece on Discipline. It actually wasn't that easy for me to go back. I had to kind of work my way back. I mean, Lark's Tongues, that was easy.
That was one of my favorite tracks. That's Lark's Tongue in Aspic, Part 2, from the album of the same name, Lark's Tongue in Aspic. That was King Crimson, and this is Notes from an Artist on CygnusRadio.com.
I really love that lean, sparkly, percussive stuff from this. By the way, we're actually going to do it all. Gabriel and I are just starting this week on the Wetton years.
Oh, okay.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so we're going to do them in blocks. We'll do the three Wetton records, and then I don't know what. We'll go to the double trio, the double duo, the later duo. And
well, oddly enough, Ian McDonald was my brother-in-law.
Oh.
I married his wife's sister. He and I were in a band together, so I blame him for that.
Nice. Nice.
I must tell you, those first couple of Crimson records, and when Ian and I started recording, the man has the most incredible ears. I learned more from him in the mixing studio than virtually anyone else I work with. Just brilliant musician.
Oh, that's awesome. I never met him.
What has been the reaction from Robert Fripp and some of the other King Crimson alumni to your transcription book?
So Robert's he's very happy that it's being done. The first one, as soon as we finished it, I did all the tabs, and then we had three proofreaders, and we had a lot of arguments about not the pitches. Gabriel and I had a lot of arguments about how to, should this be an E flat or a D sharp? We had a lot of arguments about that during the Thrack record. But when it came to the Discipline era, pitches were a lot clearer, but like the tabs, we tabbed every one of Adrian's solos, and nobody really knows how those were done. We looked at videos, and so there was a lot of arguments about whether this is an artificial harmonic and is it the synth, because that was guitar synth era too. So as soon as we finished it, Gabriel found a few mistakes. So we decided we're just finishing up the second edition. It's not that many mistakes, but he's such a stickler. And most of them are in the tabbing. So I wrote to Robert and Bill and Tony and said, Adrian doesn't even care, actually. He's really funny about it. But I wrote to them and said, look, do you guys mind waiting for the second edition? And I'll send you one. And they said, oh yeah, we're in no rush. Tony's like, this is not even for me. I was like, but if you ever wanted to play those parts, you could, it's kind of a monumental thing to be able to look in there and see what's going on. I couldn't really figure out what was going on at the time. Mm-hmm. And even when we made the transcriptions, there's stuff that Tony is doing that we had no idea he was doing it on the top side of the stick. Neurotica, Neil and Jack and me, man, he's doing all sorts of stuff in the upper register of the stick that my ears just blended it into guitar territory. And Really fascinating.
That was the League of Crafty Guitarists. That was a version of Neil and Jack and me. And folks, the reason we couldn't play the King Crimson version of that is because internet radio only allows you to play 4 songs by any one artist on any show. So instead of not playing it, I thought this version, which is technically a Robert Fripp version, would be a good substitute. This is Notes from an Artist on CygnusRadio.com.
Well, they're still on their 50th anniversary tour, and they're covering the whole breadth of King Crimson. And I actually caught it before COVID came down in 2020, and it really was extraordinary just to hear their whole body of work from 69 up until the present day. Really.
Yeah.
What was it like taking lessons, studying with Robert Fripp? What kind of teacher was he?
It was super unusual and super great. I was thinking about it this week. My thing was at the time, so it would have been like mid 80s. I was at college and I thought, I'm here studying in college and kind of a mid-level university. Like you were saying, I wasn't even allowed to play jazz guitar for credit. Like I could do classical guitar for like one course and they would allow that. Other than that, you had to be it was very conservative. And I thought, if this was 300 years ago, man, I would just be writing to Bach and say, dude, I'm coming over. Can I make your tea and wash your socks for you? So I thought I should do that.
Okay.
Why don't I do that? So I made a list of people weren't available. Like now you can write to anybody, right? And they may ignore you, but probably they won't because they're curious, So I made a list of all the musicians that I thought, hey, I'm going to write to them. And I wonder, who I should make a list of. And I made a list of all of these musicians, McLaughlin to Bowie to Gabriel to, all these people, anyone. I just kind of made a wish list and I kept going through the list and Robert kept popping up to the top for me. And I thought, this is a guy, it seems like you could learn something from. No doubt you could learn something from Bowie or Peter Gabriel or Adrian, but I didn't think they could actually tell you what they were doing and why. It would be more of an osmosis kind of thing where I thought with Robert, he can tell you some shit. And that was really true. And, one of the things that I try to work on a lot now is just kind of have this thing about authenticity, or really for me, it's almost presence. Like how present can you play a note?
That was a live improvisation at the Bearsville Theater this past year, August 13th, and it featured Pat Mastelotto, Trey Gunn, and special guest Tony Levin. This is Notes from an Artist, CygnusRadio.com.
When you see a great musician there, Pat Martino is just with every note. I haven't listened to his whole body of work, but everything's consciously being present to. And
that was the great Pat Martino doing Just Friends. This is Notes from an Artist on CygnusRadio.com.
Robert puts a lot of emphasis on that, which was not at all like my music education. Not at all. It was very, you're just back behind the theory. You're back behind the analysis. You're back behind the history. And how do you just sit down and play a middle C so that it has just amazing presence? We know when somebody does that, we know there's something going on because we encounter it every once in a while. I guess as I'm getting into my mature years, that's becoming more of a priority to me.
Yeah, it's a thread we hear quite often.
Especially now that chops are just widespread. You can't get away from chops.
So that's about it for part 1 of our great interview with Trey Gunn. I want to thank Trey and also my co-host, Tom Semioli, for another fabulous and informative part 1. As we said earlier, part 2 will be after the new year. And speaking of the new year, Tom and I want to thank all of you, our listeners, for supporting our show over the past year. We've had some incredible interviews featuring everyone from Carmine Rojas to Ron Carter to Richard Thompson, John Altman, Michael Mannering, Jeff Berlin, and on and on and on. And if you missed any of our previous shows or want to listen again, we invite you to our podcast, also titled Notes from an Artist, which you can find on all major podcast players or at notesfromanartist.buzzsprout.com. So, this is David Gross for Tom Semioli and Trey Gunn, wishing you a healthy and prosperous 2022. Thanks for listening. Have a great holiday, and we'll see you next year.